Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and we got another loaded show for you today. So we're going to kick off the show by doing a rankings of the wide receiver position groups for every team in the AFC. So I'll be doing that division by division like I did with the NFC on the last show, and I'll be talking about the fantasy implications with that. And then I'll be going into a new segment where I will be going through every team's individual schedule, and I will talk about each individual matchup within their schedules and talk about the fantasy implications with that. What are favorable matchups? What are unfavorable matchups? I did that. I went through a couple of games, a few shows ago. I kind of just went through the whole schedule and talked about, some games where there's some favorable matchups and unfavorable matchups. But now I'm going to be taking a deeper dive into every team's schedule. I'm going to be starting with the Eagles on this show, and I'm going to talk about their schedule. I'm going to do the whole NFC East, and then we'll go from there. So I'll be doing that for the next, 30-some shows. I'll have that segment number 2, dedicated to doing a deeper dive on teams' individual schedules. So that'll be segment number 2, and then segment number 3, I'll be doing a segment for the next couple of shows where I'll be going through every division again. Instead of doing a draft analysis like I just, finished doing, I'm going to do a rankings of players on every team, within a certain division, and talk about what I think, what players will be taken first, what players will be taken last, within the group of players from a certain team. And, it'll make more sense once I get up to that at that point in the show. And then finally, I will conclude with doing the top 10 tight ends that I think will be the top 10 tight ends in the 2021 NFL season. So, with that, let's get right into the first segment, which is the rankings of the wide receiver groups in the AFC, and I'll be doing that division by division. So let's get right into it. So starting off with the AFC East, I got the Jets in last place. Now, the Jets wide receiver group was really bad last year. They really didn't have a clear number one wide receiver last year. Jamison Crowder was probably their best receiver. They lost Robbie Anderson in free agency. He went to Carolina. They really didn't have any wide receivers that scared you. Brashad Perriman, he had a breakout game against New England when they played on Monday night. Joe Flacco was the quarterback. Denzel Mims is a guy that they drafted in the 2020 NFL draft, and he's going to be looking to make a big step in year 2. They brought in Corey Davis. They drafted Elijah Moore. So the receiving core is going to be a little bit better, but when it comes to fantasy, I don't really see, a lot of star power when it comes to fantasy. I think Elijah Moore could be a guy you get in dynasty leagues. I think Corey Davis is a guy that can maybe ride your bench, and maybe Jamison Crowder the same thing. But other than that, I don't really see any fantasy value as compared to the other wide receiver groups in this division. I think the Jets are, they're a team that's rebuilding. They got a rookie quarterback coming in. There's going to be some growing pains with Zach Wilson. I think the Jets are going to be competitive, and I think, at some point maybe, a Jets player that plays receiver makes an impact. We'll have to wait and see. I think as of right now, I'm not very high on any receivers on the Jets in terms of regular fantasy leagues. I think Elijah Moore has more value in dynasty leagues. And you know what, Jamison Crowder, he's shown flashes for the Jets, but I think outside of, Jamison Crowder and I guess Corey Davis, who had a breakout season in 2020, when it comes to standard leagues, I really don't see a lot of value with any of these players on the Jets. Now, I could be completely wrong. Like I said, I think the Jets are going to be better. I think their offense is going to be competitive. They're going to be able to compete. They're not going to be putrid like they've been the last couple of seasons. But, I think when it comes to fantasy, I think it's more of a wait-and-see approach, and I'm not very high on them when it comes to fantasy as opposed to some of these other teams in the division. So next up in the division, I have the New England Patriots. They had a huge overhaul in free agency, going out and getting guys like Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne to pair up with the receivers that they already have in N'Keal Harry and Jacoby Myers. Now, Julian Edelman retired. He's no longer there anymore, which is unfortunate. Edelman was a good player. He was a good fantasy player. Not the last couple of seasons, but he was productive. But you look at the Patriots, I think they're a little bit above the Jets when it comes to the wide receiver position. I just feel like the Patriots as a team are going to be better. I think their offense is going to be better. They got an improved O-line. I think the Trent Brown trade with the Raiders, I think that's going to help them out. The offensive line is going to be better. I think that's the key here. And I think also Cam Newton, year 2 in this system, I think he's got something to prove. And I think he's going to be better than he was last season. And I just think now with the Patriots adding these wide receivers, I think, they have a little bit more value than the wide receivers on the Jets. I think that Nelson Aguilar is a guy that could be a nice flex option, a guy that can ride your bench. And I think Kendrick Bourne's probably going to be somebody that's going to be on the waiver wire. Jacoby Myers, though, was not that bad last season in some games. I think he was arguably the Patriots' best receiver last year. So, I kind of see Nelson Aguilar being the best receiver out of the group on the Patriots. He did have a breakout season with the Raiders, and I just think that the Patriots as a team are better than the Jets, and I because of that, I kind of have fantasy value for the players that they have on their team. I have them a little bit higher than the Jets, but it's close. It's close. I think Corey Davis, with the Jets, I think that, he's going to be the number one guy. He's going to have to prove that, he was worth what the Jets paid him. Like I said, coming off of that career year with the Titans. So let's see how he does with the Jets. I think it's close, though, between them and the Patriots when it comes to wide receivers and their value in fantasy. But I give the Patriots a little bit of a notch up just because I think with Kendrick Bourne and Nelson Aguilar, they're going to get, more consistent play out of them. And the Patriots as a team are going to be better. So that's why I have them a little bit above the Jets. Then we go to the Buffalo Bills. Now, I'm kind of taking the same approach like I did when I said that the Packers, their wide receiver group, was second in their division. I have the Bills at number 2 just because I feel like when it comes to the Bills, I feel like it's Stephon Diggs and then there's some question marks. I think Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley will be guys that ride people's benches, but I feel like they're not going to do as good as the Miami Dolphins wide receivers who I have at number 1. Now, I think Stephon Diggs is clearly the best wide receiver in this division, but I'm saying collectively, I think Miami has more receivers that I think are going to be drafted, in the higher rounds as opposed to the Bills. I think their value collectively is higher than the Bills. Now, you could say, well, Stephon Diggs outweighs that, and that's true. I agree with that. But I'm just saying collectively, I think Miami's position groups, when it comes to wide receiver, is higher in fantasy value as opposed to the Bills, because I just feel like Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders, they could be a little bit inconsistent sometimes. And you know what, not to say that Devontae Parker can be inconsistent, because he definitely can. But like I said, I just feel like collectively as a group with the Dolphins, I think that they're a little bit higher than the Bills, just because I think that Jalen Waddle is going to have chemistry with Tua, coming in, being drafted out of Alabama. And I think Devontae Parker can have a bounce-back season. He was, had a very good season in 2019, and 2020 kind of took a little bit of a step back. And then Will Fuller was really good last year as well. So, I think once all three of those guys are on the field, Miami is going to have a good offense. It just all hinders on Tua. But like I said, I think Stephon Diggs is clearly the best wide receiver in this division. But I would say that collectively as a group with the Dolphins, I think they have more fantasy value than the Bills. So that's the AFC East when it comes to the rankings of the wide receiver groups. Okay, so now moving on to the AFC North. Coming in last is the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I'm going to say they're coming in last because I just think that the Ravens are a run-first team. They love to run the football. Not to say that it's not going to be improved, the passing game, which I think it will definitely be improved this year. But I think in terms of their wide receivers, I don't think their value is that high. I think Sammy Watkins is a guy that's boom or bust. I mean, I talked about it on one of the shows that, he had that 43-point performance against the Jaguars in Week 1 of 2019, and then really didn't do anything after that, and he's always in and out of the lineup. He's always hurt, But, I mean, that could always change. I'm just saying, from past experiences with him, he's very inconsistent, boom or bust. So then you got him, Marquise Brown. A lot of people were expecting him to take a big jump in year 2, and he did not live up to that. And then, of course, they drafted Rashad Bateman. So, I think the wide receiver groups, when it pertains to Baltimore, I think it's definitely going to be improved this year. I think Rashad Bateman, his value is going to be high in dynasty leagues. I think that, collectively as a group, though, when it comes to the Ravens, it's going to be the weakest just because, looking at what they did last year in the passing game, they were last in passing. They're a run-first football team. And, that works. It's just they got to be able to throw the football at times. And, they sometimes struggle to do that, particularly when it comes to the playoffs. But, I think when it comes to fantasy, I think that, their wide receiver group is probably the weakest. So that's why I have them in last in the division. Then moving on, I got the Pittsburgh Steelers at number 3. I have them at number 3 just because I don't know what to expect from them this year. They did officially sign Najee Harris, their running back, to a 4-year contract. So that's good for them, though that doesn't really pertain to what I'm talking about. I just wanted to throw that out there as news. But, I think Chase Claypool is probably the best wide receiver out of all the wide receivers in Pittsburgh. I think he has the highest value. So I think that, and I also think that he's better than the wide receivers on Baltimore at this very moment. I also think that Deontay Johnson, he could be another guy that is slept on, and maybe some people want to draft him. Juju Smith-Schuster I'm very low on this year. I think that, he's probably a solid bench player. I think he could be a flex option as well. I don't really think he's a guy that you would particularly want to have in your starting lineups just because of what he's done as the really the number one wide receiver, quote unquote, since Antonio Brown left. I think it all hinders on the quarterback, of course. If Ben's protected, listen, then the wide receivers are going to be really good this year. And they are really talented, not to say they're not talented. It's just I think when it comes to fantasy, we don't really know what to expect. If Ben's not good this year, this offense is not going to be good this year. If Ben is good, they're going to be good. I think Claypool is probably your best bet. I think he's a solid flex option. I don't want to say number 2 yet. I'd have to see a little bit more from him, maybe a little more consistency. But I think he's probably one of the Steelers that he has the highest value. So I think when it comes to the other wide receivers, I think they would probably, I'd be more comfortable having them on my bench as opposed to in my lineup, of course, depending on who I have. So the Steelers at number 3 in the division. Then you move on to the Bengals. I think that if Joe Burrow comes back, I think Jamar Chase is going to be a stud. I think that he's somebody that could be a solid flex option. Again, I'm not very high on rookies in their rookie seasons. I tend to stay away from them. But listen, I think he could be a stud. And, he's definitely going to be somebody that a lot of people are going to take in dynasty leagues. But when it comes to regular standard leagues, he could be a solid flex option. Same thing with T. Higgins. I mean, we'll see what happens now. I mean, those are going to be the main guys that Joe Burrow is going to be throwing to. And Joe Burrow is supposedly going to be ready for week 1. So I'm a little bit higher on these guys as opposed to the Steelers. And also, hopefully Joe Burrow comes back healthy. And if he's healthy, he's a young mobile QB. He's going to be able to get it done. And, I think the wide receivers are going to be pretty good for the Bengals as well. He's just got to have time to throw the ball. So I'm a little bit higher on the Bengals wide receivers as opposed to the Steelers wide receivers. But again, it all depends on how Ben plays. If Ben plays well and the O-line is solid, then, my opinion changes with that. So then, at number 1, I have the Browns. They got the best O-line in the division, I think. I think, Baker Mayfield could possibly be the best quarterback in the division. I think that Lamar Jackson is the best playmaker in this division, but Lamar Jackson has some issues when it comes to the passing game. And I think that the Browns' wide receivers are probably the best. I think that Odell Beckham Jr. is probably the best wide receiver in this division when he's healthy. He's just got to be more consistent and hopefully comes back strong from the ACL tear that he suffered last year. Jarvis Landry, I think he's somebody that, might go undrafted in a lot of leagues. I think he's somebody that can ride on your bench as well. But, I could see Odell being a guy that a lot of people are going to draft. I think he's still, somebody that you could possibly put in your starting lineups, even with coming back from this horrific injury. And he's come back from injuries before. He did have that broken leg or ankle injury that he suffered back in 2017 that had him, miss the entire season. So he's come back from horrific injuries before, and I think he could definitely come back strong from this one as well. I just think when it comes to fantasy value, I think I'm more confident in him than I am in a lot of the other receivers in this division. I think collectively as a group, the Browns have the best wide receivers, when it comes to fantasy. And I just think that Baker Mayfield's going to be protected. They have the best running game in the division, I think. When it comes to Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, I think they have the best 1-2 punch in the division and in the NFL. I think with all that, I think the Browns receivers are going to excel this year. Baker's going to have a lot of time to throw the football and, continue to grow and become a better quarterback. So I have the Browns wide receivers at number 1. I think Odell Beckham Jr. is going to be somebody that's going to be taken within, the first 5 or 6 rounds, maybe in between the 5th or 7th round. I think that's probably an accurate place where Beckham's probably going to be taken. And I think he's going to want to prove something. So I don't know. I feel like for him, I think he probably has the highest value at wide receiver in this division. That's just me. So moving on to the AFC South. Coming in last is the Houston Texans. And the main reason for that is we don't know who's going to be quarterback for this team. I think Brandon Cooks is somebody, if he gets traded somewhere else, he's going to be really good and somebody that you want to have on your teams. He was really good towards the end of last year. But that was with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. We don't really know who's going to be quarterback for this team. So I'd probably just stay away from drafting anybody from the Texans, particularly their wide receivers. They don't really have a lot of value as long as Deshaun Watson is not the quarterback. And, they're bringing in so many different quarterbacks. Who knows who the quarterback's going to be? So I'd stay away from drafting any of them. I don't really see a lot of value in them if Deshaun Watson's not the quarterback. So Houston Texans in last place in the division when it comes to their wide receiver group. All right, so in third is the Indianapolis Colts. They brought back T.Y. Hilton. Michael Pittman will be entering his second season. Zach Pascal is there. They got some young, nice pieces. But I think in terms of their fantasy value, I think it's a little bit low. And I'd probably put them in third in the division. Now, I think that they just need time to develop a relationship, a rapport with Carson Wentz. I just feel like the other two teams in this division, I feel like they're a little bit of a notch up compared to the Colts. Just because, T.Y. Hilton's not what he was a couple years ago. Michael Pittman's entering his second season. Now, Michael Pittman makes a big jump from year 1 to year 2. Then, maybe the Colts are a little bit higher on this list. I think with Carson Wentz, the offense is going to be better. But I just feel like the other two teams, I feel like have more established wide receivers that I'd probably put ahead of the Colts. So at number 2, I have the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think DJ Chark and Marvin Jones are guys that you should get on your team. Marvin Jones is touchdown dependent. A lot of people have talked about that, but I think with Trevor Lawrence, I think it's going to be a nice connection there. I think this is going to be the best quarterback that DJ Chark has ever played with. I think that collectively as a group, they're a little bit better than the Colts. However, I think the Colts, of course, are going to be a better team, but I think DJ Chark and Marvin Jones are better fantasy options as opposed to Michael Pittman and T.Y. Hilton. So then coming in first place in the division is the Tennessee Titans because of A.J. Brown. Now, I just think that, I think he's probably the most solid fantasy option out of the wide receivers in this division. I think, I talked about how Devontae Adams and Stephon Diggs, for their respective teams, they came in second place. The Packers I had at number 2 in the NFC North, and I had the Bills at number 2 in the AFC East. But I just feel like there's a lot of question marks surrounding this division because the Texans, they don't have a quarterback. You look at the Colts, they got a new quarterback coming in, and, he doesn't really have a rapport with the receivers there. Then Jacksonville, Marvin Jones is touchdown dependent. DJ Chark is a little bit, He was injured a little bit last season, and it was a little bit inconsistent. So that's kind of why I have them, where I have them on this list in the AFC South. And I have A.J. Brown at number 1, for the Tennessee Titans. Because I think, he's going to be top 10 wide receiver. I just feel like there's a lot of unknowns overall in the division. Deshaun Watson is probably not going to be starting for the Texans next year. Then you got Carson Wentz coming over from the Eagles. And then you have the Jaguars with a new quarterback as well, though I think it's going to succeed. I just feel like Ryan Tannehill and A.J. Brown, there's no question marks there. They're going to be good this year, and they're going to be solid. So that's my rationale for the AFC South. Then going to the AFC West, which is the last division that I'll be going over, I got the Raiders in last just because Henry Ruggs is there, and then really outside of that, there's a lot of question marks. Then going to the Broncos, there's question marks at quarterback, with Drew Lock, and who knows, maybe Aaron Rodgers might be the quarterback in a few weeks. But they're a lot better than the Raiders are when it comes to the wide receiver spot. I think Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy are guys you want to have on your team. I think Henry Ruggs is somebody you want to have on your team too. Then you got the Chargers. Justin Herbert is going to be insane this year. I think Keenan Allen is somebody you have to have on your team. Mike Williams, I think, he could ride your bench, but particularly in deeper leagues, but I'd probably stay away from him. Maybe, a guy you pick up off the waiver wire. And then finally, the Chiefs. I mean, what else can you say with them? Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in the NFL. Tyreek Hill's a guy that's going to be taken in the first round. And, they're going to be really good this year once again. So those are my wide receiver group rankings by division in the AFC. So with that, we're going to take our first break. When we come back, we are going to look into the Philadelphia Eagles schedule for our first schedule outlook and talk about the favorable and unfavorable matchups throughout each week in the Eagles schedule. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we are back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for segment number 2. We are going to do a schedule outlook on the Philadelphia Eagles. So this will be the first schedule outlook that I do. I'll go through game by game for the Eagles schedule, and I will talk about the favorable and unfavorable matchups throughout the schedule, and I will be doing that for every NFL team leading up to the season in September. So we'll have one segment dedicated to that for the next 32 shows, counting this show. So with the Eagles schedule, you got them opening up against the Atlanta Falcons. And I think this is a very favorable matchup for the Eagles. I think this is a nice start to the season. We saw what Jalen Hurts could do against some mediocre defenses like the Arizona Cardinals last year. And he played really well in that game in terms of fantasy. And I think this is a good matchup for the Eagles to open up the season. I don't want to say they're necessarily going to win this game, but I think you could. I feel comfortable saying you could start guys like Dallas Goedert, Miles Sanders, and even Jalen Hurts if you got him in, let's say, a 2 QB league like the ones that I do. I think this is, like I said, I think this is a very good matchup for the Eagles. The Falcons' defense really wasn't that good last year, and really hasn't been good for the last couple of seasons. And I don't know if they're going to be that good this year. So I would say this is a favorable matchup to start Eagles players like Miles Sanders, Dallas Goedert, and Jalen Hurts. Now, when it comes to guys like Jalen Reagor and Devontae Smith, I think Devontae Smith is probably somebody you would want to start as well. I would say probably start him at the flex. Because at least for me, because like I've talked about a lot on the show, I'm not very comfortable, when it comes to rookies. I like to see what they do their first year in the NFL, and then I feel more comfortable drafting them, for their sophomore seasons. So that's my take on that. I think, like I said, I think the Falcons' Week 1 is a good matchup for the Eagles players. Now, Week 2 is interesting. The Eagles are playing the 49ers, but this is at home, a 1 o'clock game on Fox. I think this is a bad matchup for the Eagles because with the 49ers at full strength, they're going to be a different defense. I think this is a bad matchup for the Eagles. However, I think you could maybe find some success in starting Jalen Hurts if you wanted to, because the 49ers have struggled against mobile QBs like Kyler Murray, like Russell Wilson. They're better against pocket passer QBs. Now, not to say that Jalen Hurts is going to light the world on fire in this matchup, but we've seen the 49ers have a tendency to struggle against some mobile QBs. So, maybe you start Jalen Hurts if you wanted to, if you were desperate. I mean, it's Week 2. I don't really see a lot of people being desperate at Week 2, but crazier things have happened. I think definitely Miles Sanders, this is a bad matchup for him going up against this 49ers defense. I think you can start Dallas Goedert. And then, maybe the wide receivers have a good game. Let's see what the 49ers secondary is all about. They did lose Richard Sherman in the offseason. I think collectively the 49ers are going to be a better team, but we'll have to wait and see. I think this is a bad matchup for the Eagles, but you could find some success in starting some of these guys. I think Miles Sanders has the worst matchup out of, all the Eagles players, just because I think that 49ers defense, particularly their front seven, is going to be what it was in 2019. I mean, let's be honest. They're going to be at full strength. All right, so next you got the Cowboys. The Eagles are going to Dallas, Week 3, on Monday Night Football. I think the Eagles can find some success there. Now, Jalen Hurts had a good beginning to his first start against the Cowboys, but then he kind of fell off, and the Cowboys ended up destroying the Eagles in that game. He had 2 touchdown passes. It looked like the Eagles were going to be, walking away with the victory in that game, and the Cowboys, they came back and they destroyed the Eagles. I think this is a favorable matchup for some Eagles players. Now, another player that I've completely forgot about that's still on the team right now is Zach Ertz. Right now, I'm going to be under the assumption that at some point the Eagles are going to move on from him. So I'm just not really going to talk about him in this, just because I feel like he's going to be gone. And, really didn't have a good season last year, was riddled with injuries, and really was not that good when he played. So I think he's really, at this moment, is going to be a non-factor. But, in 2019, he was really good, and who knows, maybe he has a renaissance of a season. I don't know, but I'm just going to kind of leave Zach Ertz out as of right now, because I don't know what his future is. Now, I haven't done that with guys like Aaron Rodgers. Because I'm under the assumption Aaron Rodgers is going to be with the Packers. I'm trying to be positive, but yeah, comparing Zach Ertz and Aaron Rodgers, I don't know. But yeah, so Zach Ertz, really not going to talk about him. So let's talk about the players that I know are definitely going to start for the Eagles. I think this is a favorable matchup for Dallas Goedert. I think even the wide receivers can have good games too. I think this could be Devontae Smith's breakout game for the Eagles. Just because I don't know what to expect from the Cowboys defense. They made a lot of changes in the offseason. Dan Quinn is now the defensive coordinator. They went all in on defense in the draft. So I think the defense is going to be better. But, right now I'm still at the mindset that they're not going to be as good as some people may think they're going to be now that they, stocked up on defensive players in the draft. So I'm just going to assume that the defense is still going to be underwhelming. And I see the Eagles receivers having a good game here. So I think this is more of a favorable matchup for the Eagles. And then moving on to Week 4, the Kansas City Chiefs come to town. I think this is another favorable matchup just because, if it's a blowout, I think you're going to see a lot of garbage points. I think the Eagles are going to be able to put up points against the Chiefs. The Chiefs their defense is good. It's a solid unit. Though they do have the tendency to give up some big plays. They sometimes bend. They bend, but they don't break. In the Super Bowl, a little bit. They broke a little bit, putting it nicely. I could definitely see, Jalen Hurts having a good game here. I could see the wide receivers and Dallas Goedert having a good game here. I think this is another defense that, the Eagles can do a little bit of damage. Now, I think the Chiefs are going to win this game, but I think in terms of fantasy, I think the Eagles players can have some solid performances in this matchup. Now, in Week 5, I see the same thing happening when they go to Carolina. It's a 1 o'clock game on Fox. I definitely could see the Eagles having some good performances there. The Panthers' defense really isn't that good. The Chiefs' defense is better than the Panthers' defense, but I just think that this is another instance where Eagles players can find some success in this matchup. I think this could be a very high-scoring game. Both defenses are not very good. The Eagles' front seven, their pass rush, I think is still respectable, and I think that's what gives the Eagles the edge in this matchup. Also, the fact that Sam Darnold does have a tendency to turn the ball over a lot. But I could see this game being a high-scoring game, and the Eagles finding some success in this matchup as well. Then this is where it's an unfavorable matchup. Week 6 against the Buccaneers. I already talked about that on a previous show, but I'll just reiterate what I said. The Bucs, they got all their guys returning. They're a really good defense, and they're a defense that is suffocating. And I think the secondary is going to be better this year. They got a lot of young guys in the secondary, and they played well down the stretch in the playoffs. You got that front seven that's nasty. I think this is going to be a very tough matchup for the Eagles, and I think that, particularly guys like Miles Sanders, you probably maybe want to consider sitting just because the Bucs' rush D is really good, and I just feel like this is going to be a blowout, this game. Now, I could be completely wrong. We'll see what happens, but I feel like looking at this game right now, I feel like the Bucs are going to absolutely destroy the Eagles, and it's going to be a rough time for those Eagles players. So I would probably avoid starting some Eagles players in this matchup. I think the safe bets is starting Dallas Goedert. I feel like Dallas Goedert, for the most part, is a safe bet to start, but I think when it comes to the running backs and, even Jalen Hurts, I think that they should probably sit out that week if you have them on your team. Then moving on, we got the Vegas Raiders. The Eagles will be going there in Week 7. I think this is another good matchup for the Eagles. The Raiders' defense really isn't that good. I think this has the potential to be a high-scoring game. I think guys like Miles Sanders can have a big game. Jalen Hurts can have a big game. Dallas Goedert can have a big game. And the receivers are going to have a big game. I think all around, I think the Eagles' offense and their players can have good games. So I think this will be a good week to start some players on the Eagles. Unless the Raiders' defense vastly improves, which, I don't really see that as of right now. But, once games start happening and the defense shows something, then, my opinion will change. But I think this is a favorable matchup for the Eagles, and I think you would want to start a lot of the players from the Eagles when they play Vegas. So moving on to week number 8, the Eagles go to Detroit to play the Lions, and I think this is another favorable matchup for the Eagles as well. The Lions defense really isn't that good. They've made some improvements, but I just think that, the Lions, they're another team. They're a team that's rebuilding, and I like Dan Campbell. I think he is going to kind of have some sort of Joe Judge impact, some culture change like Joe Judge has had with the Giants. And I think the Lions are going to be a competitive team at some point. With Dan Campbell, listening to the press conference, when he was talking about, biting off people's kneecaps and stuff, that was a little ridiculous, but I went back and I rewatched it a little bit more. I think he's going to be an exceptional leader for that team, and I think he's going to provide the culture change that the Lions desperately need. And I hope the Lions do good. I hope Jared Goff does good. But, when it comes to this matchup in fantasy, I think the Eagles will do good in this matchup. I think Jalen Hurts will have a good game. I think Miles Sanders will have a good game. And like I said, Dallas Goedert, I don't think you really can go wrong with starting him at tight end because, like I always talk about, tight end is a very thin position. And I could see the receivers doing good as well. I could see Devontae Smith having a good game. So now moving on to week number 9, the Chargers come to town. And I don't really know what to think of this matchup because the Chargers defense really hasn't been that good. It wasn't what it was back in 2018, the last couple of years. Derwin James hopefully comes back healthy. This could go either way, this matchup. I think that, it's kind of a, wait-and-see approach with this matchup because the Chargers defense could be really good. Because you got Melvin Ingram, you got Joey Bosa rushing the passer, you got Chris Harris, and hopefully Derwin James is healthy out there in the secondary, and they drafted Asante Samuel Jr. So this defense has playmakers. So I don't really know what to expect from this matchup. On the Eagles side, I think that, Jalen Hurts can find some success. But overall, I think this is kind of one of those middle-of-the-road matchups where, you really can't go wrong with sitting or starting them. I probably would lean more towards sitting just because I think the Chargers defense is going to be a little bit better this year. Then, Week 10, the Eagles go to the Mile High City and play the Broncos. That's a tough game. I think the Broncos defense is going to be really good. A lot of people are expecting them to be really good this year. The secondary is improved. Von Miller's coming back. The defense is going to be good for the Broncos. So I think this is a bad matchup for the Eagles. So I'm going to say you'd probably lean more towards sitting a lot of these guys. Again, Dallas Goedert, can't go wrong with starting the tight end because, tight end's very thin. But overall, I think the Eagles, you probably would want to sit most of their players in this matchup. So moving on in the schedule, week number 11, the Saints come to town. Last year, the Eagles beat the Saints 24-21. That was Jalen Hurts' first start, I believe. And he went 17 of 30, 167 yards, and a touchdown. Miles Sanders had a really good game, 14 carries, 115 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And Jalen Hurts actually rushed for 106 yards in that game as well. And the Saints' defense is going to be taking a little bit of a step back this year because they did lose some guys in the defense. So the Saints are going to be a weaker team than they were when they played the Eagles the last time. So I think this could be a good matchup for the Eagles. So I feel comfortable starting Miles Sanders. I think he could replicate those numbers, and I think Jalen Hurts can have a good game as well. So I would say this is a favorable matchup for the Eagles, so I'd probably lean more towards starting some of these players on the team because of the Saints taking a step back on defense, losing some guys, and based off of what happened last year. Now, it's going to be a new year. Things can change. They can have film on him, and they can completely dominate Jalen Hurts. But I think because of the personnel that they lost on defense, I would lean toward this being more of a favorable matchup for the Eagles. So I would lean more towards starting some of these guys. So moving on to week number 12, the Eagles travel to the Meadowlands to take on the Giants, and then they take on the Jets in week 13. So they'll be in New Jersey for the next 2 weeks, from week 12 to week 13. I think both matchups are interesting. I think with the Giants, I think the Giants secondary is going to be really good this year, so I'd probably avoid starting, guys like Devontae Smith and Jalen Reagor if, they're having good seasons. Miles Sanders, I could see him having an okay game. Boston Scott seems to always kill the Giants, so, if Miles Sanders is hurt, start Boston Scott. Dallas Goedert, of course, like I keep saying, you can start him. I think Jalen Hurts can have an okay game, but I think the Giants' defense is going to be really good. So this is kind of one of those, meh matchups. I really don't see the Eagles exploding and, going off in this game. I think this is going to be a close game. I don't really see a lot of points being scored in this game when it comes to fantasy from any of these guys on their team. Outside of maybe, like I said, Boston Scott, because he always seems to kill the Giants. It's kind of a joke, but, it's kind of true. He always does good against the Giants. So then we go to the Jets. I think the Jets' defense is going to be improved. I don't think it's going to be good as the Giants' defense. I think this is a more favorable matchup for the Eagles. So I would feel more comfortable starting a lot of the Eagles players against the Jets. I think this could be an underrated game. I don't know. Because of the Eagles, their defense taking a little bit of step back. Depends on how Zach Wilson plays. If Zach Wilson is terrible, then I think the Eagles should win this game. But I could see this being somewhat of a competitive game, and I could see some Eagles players doing well in this game. I could see Miles Sanders doing all right. Though the Jets I think they were not that bad against the run last year. So, we'll see what happens with that. But I think when it comes to both of these Meadowlands games, I think the Jets is more of the game that I have more confidence in some of these Eagles players to perform as opposed to the Giants game. Then we got the bye week, week 14. Week 15 against Washington. This is a home game. It's a TBA, so, it could be a Saturday night game. Who knows? I think that, Washington's defense was really good last year, and, Jalen Hurts was okay in the game against Washington in Week 17, but he was good on the ground. He was good with his legs. Really did not throw the ball that effectively in that game, and they did sit a lot of their guys. That was just a very weird game. That's a game that I see Jalen Hurts maybe struggling a little bit. Now, I think he could run it a little bit, obviously. I think really in all these games, he's going to be mobile, and he's going to provide some points on the ground. But I think when it comes to Washington, and the remainder of these games are all divisional opponents. You got Washington Week 15, the Giants Week 16, Week 17 at Washington, then at home against Dallas. Against all these divisional opponents, I could see Miles Sanders having good games here. I think that at Washington, that game's going to be a little tough just because it's an away game. I think home against the Giants, I think the Eagles perform a little bit better just because, they're at home now, and now they're seeing the Giants again for the second time around. So I think it'll be a different outcome. Well, I don't want to say a different outcome. I don't really know who's going to win what game. I don't really want to make any predictions, but I think it's more favorable the Eagles taking on the Giants at home as opposed to, being on the road against the Giants. I think Week 18 against Dallas, I think that's a favorable matchup just because it's at home, and, I could see Jalen Hurts doing good, particularly, running the football. And I really haven't talked about it until really the end of the show, but, that's the other thing you got to think about with Jalen Hurts is he's a mobile QB. I think he was really effective on the ground, and, you want to have that in fantasy, of course, as a mobile QB. You don't want to have some of these pocket passers who really don't run that much. But really, towards the end of the season, I think that, the Eagles have a soft finish to the schedule. Or, not really a soft finish, but like a favorable schedule just because of the home games. I don't want to say that they're going to win them, but I feel more comfortable saying they're favorable when it comes to fantasy. I don't know, I don't think they're going to win every single game here. But I think in terms of fantasy, I think players are going to perform here. The Giants secondary is really good. The Washington football team's front seven is really good. Dallas is the one question mark. I just got to see how Dallas's defense does. If Dallas' defense is improved, then, it's going to be tough for the Eagles. But, I could definitely see, with these last four games being, three of them being home games, I think the Eagles players will perform better in these matchups as opposed to, on the road. But we'll have to wait and see. So with that is the Eagles schedule for the 2021 NFL season, and I went through game by game and talked about, what matchups are favorable, what matchups are unfavorable. Really, those are my thoughts on that. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do a rankings of the fantasy players in the NFC East. So I'll be going team by team, and I'll be ranking the players from each team, and talk about, what their value is and whatnot. And I'll do it, player by player, team by team in the NFC East. I'm really bad at explaining things. It'll make more sense in the next segment. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For segment number 3, we are going to do fantasy players rankings of the NFC East. So I'll be going team by team and ranking the players that I think are somewhat fantasy worthy and going, from there. So I'll be doing each team in the NFC East. It'll make more sense as I go along in this segment. So let's get right into it. And I'll basically do it kind of the same as the draft analysis, where I'll go from the team that finished in last place. So we'll be going with the Philadelphia Eagles first. So, we just spent the whole segment on them. And then I'll go, from the team that finished in third place all the way up to first place. So let's start with the Philadelphia Eagles. So the first player that I think you should get from the Eagles, if he's available to you, and, you feel like you could pick him at the right spot, is Miles Sanders. Now, the Eagles collectively as a team dealt with a lot of injuries last year, and Miles Sanders was one of them. I think he's the best player out of everybody on the Eagles when it comes to fantasy as of right now. I think that he's a solid RB2, and I think that, the other thing that he benefits from is him being a pass catcher. I think that helps him out tremendously. So I think, particularly when it comes to PPR leagues, I think he's definitely somebody that, is going to have higher value in those leagues. But I think he's a solid RB2. I think that, you should definitely consider getting him on your team. Then moving on, you got Devontae Smith. Him, obviously being drafted by the Eagles, is going to be the number 1 wide receiver. I think he's a guy that's going to be taken in the later rounds in a lot of leagues. Like I've talked about on previous shows, when it comes to dynasty leagues, he's going to have increased value. But I think when it comes to regular leagues, he's going to be a guy that's going to be taken in the later rounds. I think he's the second best player when it comes to fantasy for the Eagles. And then moving on, Dallas Goedert. I didn't include Zach Ertz here just because I don't know what the deal is with him. I don't know what the story is, if they're going to get rid of him or not. But I have Dallas Goedert here. I think Dallas Goedert could be a solid tight end. He proved that last year when he was healthy. I think if Zach Ertz is not there, I think he's going to get increased targets. Also just because, he's not going to have... There's not a lot of receivers on this team that, you really can depend on when it comes to fantasy. I think really Devontae Smith and possibly Jalen Reagor. But outside of that, I think Dallas Goedert is going to be one of the top targets in Philadelphia. So I think that, if you're desperate for a tight end and you haven't really drafted one and you feel like you could take a chance on Dallas Goedert, I think he's a guy you definitely could get. And then I feel like with Jalen Hurts, he's the last guy I have here. The quarterback position is really deep, and I feel like he's a guy that could be slept on and be taken in the later rounds like Devontae Smith. I feel like he could be a solid QB2. He was definitely a solid QB2 for me. I thought he was really good, at times in the starts that he played in, especially the Cardinals game where he dropped, I think it was like 37 points. But I think that in terms of value, I think he's probably the last. He's probably in last just because of the position that he plays. You can get so many other quarterbacks, and, I think he's going to have somewhat of a productive season. But I think in terms of the players on the Eagles, I think he's probably a guy that's going to be taken last out of the guys on the Eagles, just because of the position that he plays. I could be wrong, but, I feel like when it comes to Dallas Goedert, tight ends are, at a minimum, and you got to get them. And, Devontae Smith, I think, could be a stud, so he's probably going to be a guy that's going to be taken, taken earlier than Dallas Goedert and Jalen Hurts. And I think Miles Sanders, I think, is probably the best fantasy player on the Eagles, especially because of the value that he adds when it comes to the passing game. So that is my rankings for the players on the Eagles when it comes to fantasy. Now, moving on to the team that finished in third place in the division, and that is the Dallas Cowboys. So, number 1 is Ezekiel Elliott. I think Ezekiel Elliott is going to go back to being a top 10 fantasy pick. I think he's going to maintain that status. I mean, he was that last year, but really didn't live up to that expectation because of, the injuries to the offensive line and, of course, the injuries to Dak. Now you got the offensive line coming back healthy. You got Dak hopefully coming back healthy. I think we're going to see a different Ezekiel Elliott. And also, Ezekiel Elliott did drop about, I think, 20 pounds or something, I heard. So, he slimmed down, and that's going to definitely help him out as well. I think we're going to see the Ezekiel Elliott that we are accustomed to seeing in fantasy. And because of that, I think he has the best value just because, that's probably the best valued position is the running back spot. I really haven't talked about, how I would rank, position groups in terms of fantasy. I think the running back spot is the one that's the most valued because, you got to have good running backs. Quarterbacks you're going to get. Quarterbacks are very deep. You can get quarterbacks, in later rounds. I feel like the philosophy of fantasy has really changed over the course of the last, 5 or 6 years. Now people start valuing running backs a lot more as opposed to what they did, 4 or 5 years ago where, people were taking quarterbacks with the first overall pick, like me. I don't know, that's just how I see it. But, yeah, needless to say, Ezekiel Elliott, I think, is going to return to the fantasy stud that he's been. I say that he is going to be the number one player taken from Dallas. Then moving on, I think it's kind of neck and neck between these two, but I put Amari Cooper ahead of Dak. I think that, like I talked about with quarterbacks, quarterbacks, it's very deep. And I think you want to build the rest of your team before you start worrying about the quarterbacks that you get. Now, obviously, in 2 QB leagues, quarterbacks are more valued a little bit just because you want to have 2 solid QBs. You don't want to have one strong one and one really weak one. But, of course, in 1 QB leagues, that's a little bit different. You could wait as long as you want, really, until, the first quarterback is taken off the board. Then you start to survey your options and see who's out there. But when it comes to the Cowboys, I think that Amari Cooper is probably going to be the second player taken off the board that is a Dallas Cowboy, just because him and Dak Prescott have a really good connection. Since Amari Cooper has come to the Cowboys, him and Dak have really, hooked up on many occasions. Amari Cooper, there are times where he does lay goose eggs and he could be inconsistent, but I think that with the Cowboys, he's been really good. He's a solid number 1 wide receiver. I feel more comfortable saying he's a solid number 2, for me, but I think that he's probably going to be the second Cowboys player taken off the board, and I think he's a guy that you definitely want to have on your team, especially if Dak is healthy. And then, of course, I have Dak at number 3. I think he's going to be a top 10 fantasy QB this year. I think he's hopefully going to come back healthy. I think he's going to come back healthy. He's going to come back strong. He's going to be motivated. I think that he's going to be a top 10 fantasy QB. Dallas, who knows what they're going to be, in real life, if they're going to be a playoff team, whatever. They do have an easy schedule, but, it could be another case where, Dallas is getting a bunch of garbage points. And, again, who cares? It's fantasy. You want to get those garbage time points regardless because, that helps you out in fantasy. Who cares, if the Cowboys, are scoring garbage time points? I mean, unless, if you're a fan, you want them to do that in fantasy. And the Cowboys did that a lot, in the beginning of last year with Dak, when they were in those, crazy games, So, yeah, Zeke, Amari Cooper, then Dak, and then I would say CeeDee Lamb is probably the last guy that's really fantasy worthy. You got guys like Michael Gallup and Dalton Schultz and Blake Jarwin. Quick thing, when the Cowboys are playing the Giants, pick up Blake Jarwin and start him at tight end because it is a guarantee. Now, I know he's coming off of an ACL injury, but it is almost a guarantee that Blake Jarwin will score a touchdown against the Giants. So that is a week you want to start Blake Jarwin. If he's not on anybody's teams, pick him up. If your tight end spot is really bad, that is when you pick up Blake Jarwin and you start him against the Giants. Because like I said, it is a guarantee that he will score a touchdown against the Giants. Came out of nowhere in 2018. Came out of nowhere. He was a nobody. 2018, the last week of the season, the guy had 3 touchdowns against the Giants. Where did he come from? I don't know. But, yeah, I'm getting a little bit off topic. But, yeah, CeeDee Lamb is probably like the last player on the Dallas that I would say is probably fantasy worthy. I think, you could potentially draft either Dalton Schultz or Blake Jarwin, if you want to have like a second tight end on your team. It really all depends, how deep your league is, of course. Typically, I think with my league, when we got 8 to 10 guys in the league, those guys are probably like guys like Blake Jarwin and Dalton Schultz are probably going to be, waiver wire pickups. Just because, when we think of Dallas, we think of their receivers. I think Michael Gallup has a better chance of being drafted as opposed to the 2 tight ends, just because I feel like, they target the wide receivers a lot more, in Dallas as opposed to the tight ends. But yeah, I think with the Cowboys, Zeke's going to go first, then Amari, then Dak, and then CeeDee Lamb. And then, depending on how deep your league is, I think Michael Gallup would probably be the second, well, not the second guy, but the next guy that would potentially get drafted. Zeke's probably going to be a top 10 pick. Amari's going to be taken, in between rounds 2 through 4. He's going to be taken within that range. Dak, I think when it comes to the 2 QB leagues, probably going to be taken, in the later rounds, like between, I guess, 7 and 8, around there. I think that's really when people start drafting QBs. And then, of course, 1 QB leagues, probably around that same thing. And then CeeDee Lamb, again, I think is going to be a solid flex option. Probably going to be taken, maybe a little bit sooner. Who knows? But I think he's probably going to be taken around that same area as Dak. I think CeeDee's going to be a solid flex option. He showed a lot of promise last year. And I think now with Dak, consistent QB play, he's going to have a good season. So those are my rankings for the players on the Cowboys. Then moving on, you got the New York Football Giants. At number 1, of course, is Saquon Barkley. I think he's obviously the best player when it comes to fantasy. He's probably going to be the one that many people are going to draft in the first round. I feel like for me, he's probably going to dip a little bit just because of the injury history. I think he still could be a solid number 1 running back, and hopefully the Giants' offensive line is improved. But, needless to say, obviously, out of the guys here, I think he's probably going to be the first Giant taken off the board. He's going to be taken in the first round. I think there's no question about it. And this could possibly be his best season in the NFL. If he's healthy, because the Giants' offensive line, I think, is going to be improved this year. They are putting a lot of stock in the young guys that they drafted over the course of the last couple of years and guys that they brought in. So hopefully this is the best Giants' offensive line that we've seen, at least coming from a Giants fan, that we've seen in a long time. And, if the Giants' run blocking is good like it was towards the end of last year, maybe Saquon finally, has a really good year. Well, not to say that he hasn't had a good years. But, maybe this is the year that, really shows the doubters why the Giants took Saquon Barkley with the number 2 overall pick a couple of years ago. So moving on in this list, I think Kenny Golladay will be the second Giant taken off the board in fantasy. This is a guy that I think is clearly the Giants' number 1 wide receiver. I think there's no question about it. I think he gives the Giants something that they haven't had in a long time. A big wide receiver that can go up and get those 50-50 balls. They thought they were going to get that with Brandon Marshall a couple of years ago, but they did not get that. He only played in, 4 games, I think. I mean, the entire Giants receiving corps got hurt in week 5 against the Chargers. So Brandon Marshall did not pan out the way the Giants hoped for. Kenny Golladay is that do-over. And Kenny Golladay is coming off of a season that he dealt with injuries, and I think a lot of people understand that. I think he's really going to help out this offense. He's going to help out the other guys in this offense like Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard, who were looked upon as the number 1 and number 2 wide receivers. Now they slide down to the number 2, number 3. And I think that's really going to open up the opportunities for this offense. It's going to put defenses are going to be really focused in on Kenny Golladay, and that's going to open up the door for opportunities like for Darius Slayton, who I think will be the 3rd Giant taken off the board in fantasy. I think between him and Sterling Shepard, it's probably going to be neck and neck between the two. I think Sterling Shepard has a better connection with Daniel Jones. I think Sterling Shepard gets more targets than Darius Slayton does. That's, I don't know, that's what I get from that. But I think Darius Slayton, I think more people would want to take him just because, he's a deep threat, and he gets the touchdowns. He's more of the touchdown guy in this offense as opposed to Sterling Shepard. I think Sterling Shepard's kind of the guy that, moves the chains and stuff. Not to say that that's not bad. I think Sterling Shepard provides more of the volume, but I think Darius Slayton kind of provides more production when it comes to, the red zone and getting touchdowns and stuff. I think that will probably put Darius Slayton ahead of Sterling Shepard in the rankings there. So far, Saquon, Kenny Golladay, Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, that's kind of the order I went in. Then after that, I think Daniel Jones would be the next pick after those guys. So Saquon, obviously, I think is a first-round pick. Kenny Golladay is probably going to go between the 2nd round and the 4th round. Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard probably taken within or in between, I guess I want to say the 6th and the 8th round, maybe a little bit later than that. Then Daniel Jones is probably going to be, another late-round pick. I think he could be a QB3 on your team if you're doing a 2 QB league. I think in terms of 1 QB leagues, I think he's probably going to be, I think he's going to go undrafted in a lot of leagues. Could possibly be a backup. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I personally think he's going to have a good season. I think if he's protected, he showed what he could do his rookie season, and then in his sophomore season, he cut down on the turnovers. So if he puts what he did statistically in his rookie season and combine that with the reduction in the amount of turnovers he had last season, I think he could be solid this year. Now, I'm not saying he's going to light the world on fire and be amazing, but I think that he's going to be solid. And I think he could be a solid QB2 if he pans out. I think that's his ceiling. So, Daniel Jones probably would be taken fifth out of the guys that I named so far. Then, the last three guys, Evan Ingram, Kyle Rudolph, Kadarius Toney. I think Kadarius Toney is probably going to be taken last. I don't know, just because, there's so many wide receivers on this team. And I think the tight end spot, I think there's more value between Evan Ingram and Kyle Rudolph as opposed to Kadarius Toney, just because of like I said, the amount of wide receivers on this team for the Giants. And let's not forget, John Ross is also on this team too. So he's going to, maybe get some playing time as well. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what role Toney has on this team. And, if he, stands out among guys like Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton, then he's going to get more targets and, maybe a guy that could be a hot waiver wire pick. But I think when it comes to, looking at the guys that I have here, I think as of right now, I would probably have him last among, the Giants that I have here. Not to say that he's going to be the worst out of all the Giants that are here. I think that that's where he's going to get drafted if he does indeed get drafted. And like I always say, the tight end spot is very thin. Evan Ingram, hopefully he puts it all together this year and has a good season. I think he's probably better than Kyle Rudolph. I think Kyle Rudolph's probably going to be a guy that's going to be used more for blocking and, in the red zone. So, maybe that gives him more value than Evan Ingram, but I think Evan Ingram's going to be the number one tight end as of right now. I think Kyle Rudolph is good if Evan Ingram gets hurt. I think that's when Kyle Rudolph could be a guy that, potentially could get some, starts on some teams in fantasy leagues as if Evan Ingram gets hurt. I think Evan Ingram is going to be the number one tight end for the Giants as of right now. So we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I think they have more value over Toney just because, there's more wide receivers on this team that I think are fantasy worthy than Kadarius Toney. And I think that, the Giants, I don't want to say they're thin at tight end, but, the tight end is a very thin spot. And I think tight ends have a little bit more value. I think these tight ends on the Giants have a little bit more value than Toney. So that's how I have the list there for the Giants. And then finally, we got the Washington football team. So I got Terry McLaurin as the number one player that I think is going to be taken out of the players on Washington. I think he could be a solid, number two wide receiver, possibly, number one wide receiver when it comes to fantasy. And I think he's proven that. I think now with Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think this could possibly be his best season just because of what I've talked about, I think, on the previous show, that Ryan Fitzpatrick provides more explosive plays. So I have him at number one. Then at number two, I have Antonio Gibson. I think he's going to be a solid RB2. He, had a couple of breakout games last year, did deal with some injuries down the stretch, but I think this Washington offense is going to be kind of underrated. So I would probably say, because of what I talked about with the running back position having more value, having the most value out of all the positions, I think he's probably going to be taken second. Curtis Samuel, I think, would be third. I think he could be possibly a nice number two wide receiver on your team. I would feel more strongly about him being a flex option, so I'd have him at number three. Logan Thomas, I think, could be a tight end one for your team. He did have some good games last season, and I think, again, like Terry McLaurin, he can provide some with Ryan Fitzpatrick now in that offense. I think Fitzpatrick is going to provide more explosive plays for this offense, and I think Logan Thomas is going to benefit from that. So I would have Logan Thomas at number four. Then Ryan Fitzpatrick would be number five. I think Fitzpatrick could be a QB2 on your team. I really do. The thing you got to worry about is, like I talked about, is the turnovers, but I think he could be solid for your team. And then Adam Humphries I just threw on there as well. I think he's probably going to go undrafted in most leagues, but, depending on how deep your league is, he could be a guy that, is on your bench. So Terry McLaurin probably going to be taken, going through the players again. Terry McLaurin probably going to be taken, within the first, probably in between round 3 and 5, I want to say. Antonio Gibson probably going to be taken around that same time as well. Curtis Samuel maybe between rounds 4 and 6. Logan Thomas probably around that same threshold. Ryan Fitzpatrick probably going to be taken in the later rounds, and then Adam Humphries is probably going to go undrafted. So, yeah, those are my rankings for the Washington football team, and those are my player rankings for the NFC East. So, with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we are going to rank the top 10 tight ends that I think will be the top 10 tight ends in fantasy in 2021. So, stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For the last segment of the show, we are going to do a top 10 list of the top 10 tight ends that I think will be the top 10 tight ends in fantasy in 2021. So, starting at number 10, I got Kyle Pitts. Now, Kyle Pitts was taken in the first round by Atlanta, and he's going to be the tight end for Atlanta. I think the reason why I have him at tight end, well, the reason why I have him at number 10 and in the top 10 is just because now with all the stuff circulating with Julio Jones, I think that now that Julio Jones may no longer be in Atlanta, and, you know, stuff that came out, Julio Jones was called up by Shannon Sharp on Undisputed, and Julio Jones said that he's out of Atlanta, so it looks like he's no longer going to be a part of the Falcons. I think that, you know, because of that, it's really going to come down to Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts now in this offense. And I think Matt Ryan, you know, he's proved time in and time out, you know, the consistency. You know, I think that now, you know, with Julio Jones being out of Atlanta now, that's going to give more targets to Calvin Ridley, and that's going to give more targets to Kyle Pitts, and those are going to be the number one and number two options in Atlanta. So, you know, I think with that and the combination of the fact that Matt Ryan, I think, loves to have tight ends, you know, that he can rely upon. You know, we saw that with Tony Gonzalez back in the day. I think it's going to work out. I think Kyle Pitts is going to be a guy that, you know, I think maybe I would consider getting, you know, in later rounds, you know, when it comes to fantasy. So we'll have to wait and see how he actually performs, but I think that now with Julio Jones on his way out, I think that helps out his fantasy value in Atlanta. So I have Kyle Pitts at number 10. So coming in at number 9, I got Mike Gesicki, the tight end for the Miami Dolphins. He'll be entering his 4th season in the NFL. Was a second-round pick back in the 2018 NFL Draft out of Penn State. Was tight end 7 last year. And looking at his stats, in 15 games, had 703 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns. Averaged 7.1 fantasy points per game, had 106.3 fantasy points. And, of course, you know, when I do it, I talk about the standard numbers. And, yeah, like, he's good. He's a solid tight end 7, but very inconsistent at times. And did have a goose egg last year in Week 6 against the Jets, and I actually started him in one of my leagues that week, and I was very frustrated by that performance. But, you know, some of his best games came in Week 2 against the Bills. Had 8 receptions for 130 yards and a touchdown. Had 19 points in that contest. And then in Week 13 against the Bengals, he had 9 receptions for 88 yards and a touchdown and had 14.8 points in that game. And then the week after that against Kansas City, had 5 receptions for 65 yards, 2 touchdowns, had 18.5 points in that contest. So he does have good games. It's just, I don't know, he's just very inconsistent. I don't know. That's just me. I think, you know, with Tua, full season now, I don't really know what to expect from him, but I think that he could be solid. You know, he does have really good games. It's just he's very inconsistent. But I think he's a guy that could be a tight end one still. I feel more comfortable with him being my second tight end just because I feel like he's just very inconsistent at the tight end spot. But you know what? He does when he has good games, he has really good games. You just have to, start him at the right time. So moving on to number 8, I got Dallas Goedert, the tight end for the Philadelphia Eagles. He'll be entering his 4th season in the NFL. Was a second-round pick in the 2018 NFL Draft. He's probably going to be the second best weapon on this Eagles offense in terms of the wide receiver core and, the tight ends. Looking at some of his best games from last year, had 16.1 points in Week 1 against Washington, had 8 receptions for 101 yards and a touchdown in that contest. Had 13.7 against the Browns in Week 11, had 5 receptions for 77 yards and a touchdown in that contest. Then in Week 12 against Seattle, he had 7 receptions for 75 yards and a touchdown, had 13.5 points in that game. And then looking at his stats from last year, like his full stats, in 11 games, 524 yards, 3 touchdowns, averaged 6.4 points per game, which was his best, and he only had 70.4 points. That was less than what he had in 2019, where he played in 15 games, and he had 86 points in that contest. I think hopefully he stays healthy. I think with Jalen Hurts, I think he's going to be, I think he's going to be good. I think he's going to be solid. Again, tight end position, very thin. Another guy, boomer bust kind of, inconsistent. Got to start him at the right week. Now, if Zach Ertz comes out and does amazing, then forget Dallas Goedert. But as of right now, I think Dallas Goedert is the number 1 tight end in Philadelphia. So I got him at number 8. Just because, when you look at Mike Gesicki, there's a lot of weapons in Miami. And I don't know, Kyle Pitts I'm putting as a rookie as of right now. So, that's kind of what I got. So Kyle Pitts at 10, Mike Gesicki at number 9, and then Dallas Goedert at number 8. So moving on to number 7 is TJ Hawkinson, who last year was tight end 5, and looking at his stats, played in all 16 games, 723 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, had 108 fantasy points in total, 108.3, and then he averaged 6.8 fantasy points per game last year. And I think he's really Jared Goff's top weapon in this offense right now. I mean, we got to see how the wide receivers perform. Like I've talked about, Jared Goff is a downgrade from Matthew Stafford, but, I talked about it on one of the previous shows, how Jared Goff loves to target the tight ends, and, I think that's going to be a key here in this offense. I think, TJ Hawkinson's going to be a high-volume guy when it comes to the tight end spot. So, I think because of that, and I think because of how Jared Goff loves to target the tight ends and, him really being one of the only weapons on this offense, I think that's why you'd probably have to say TJ Hawkinson is going to be a top 10 tight end again in fantasy in this upcoming season. And before I get into number 5, let's go through some of TJ Hawkinson's best games. Week 1, 5 receptions, 56 yards and a touchdown, had 11.6 points against Chicago. In Week 7 against Atlanta, had 5 receptions for 59 yards and a touchdown, had 11.9 fantasy points in that contest. Had 9.9 points against Minnesota in Week 9, and I believe he had a touchdown in that contest. He did. And then against Green Bay in Week 14, had 6 receptions for 43 yards and a touchdown, had 10.3 points in that contest. So TJ Hawkinson at number 7. Now, moving on to number 6 on this list is Logan Thomas. Last year, he was tight end 3. He'll be entering his 7th season in the NFL, was a 4th-round pick back in the 2014 NFL Draft by the Arizona Cardinals, and was originally a quarterback. And he did make an appearance as a quarterback a couple times. I do remember him throwing a touchdown pass back when he was a Cardinal, and he was playing for the Cardinals, but he was playing against the Broncos in Mile High. That was when the Cardinals were dealing with some QB issues, and I remember he threw a touchdown pass. Well, it was really all running back. It was the yards after the catch is what propelled him to getting a touchdown pass. But, yeah, needless to say, he was originally a quarterback, and, now he's a tight end, and, was pretty good as a tight end last year. In 16 games last year for Washington, had 670 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, had 104.62 fantasy points. He did throw a pass in a game. It was Thanksgiving against Dallas, and he averaged 6.5 fantasy points per game. And some of his best games, he had 4 receptions for 37 yards and a touchdown against the Eagles. He had 9.7 points in that contest. In Week 6 against the Giants, he had 3 receptions for 42 yards and a touchdown, had 10.2 points in that game. Week 7 against Dallas, 4 receptions, 60 yards, and a touchdown, 12 points in that contest. And then in Week 13 against the Steelers, had 9 receptions for 98 yards and a touchdown, and he had 15.8 points in that contest. So, yeah, Logan Thomas was a solid tight end last year. I think for the most part, he was consistent. He did have a couple of games where he didn't really do much, but I think this year he's going to be really good, and I talked about it earlier in the show. Now with Ryan Fitzpatrick in the fold, I think he's going to provide more explosive plays, and I think Logan Thomas is going to benefit from that. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick and him are going to have a nice, connection going next year, and I think Logan Thomas is somebody that a lot of people should consider drafting in their fantasy leagues just because, moving from Kyle Allen and Taylor Heineke and Alex Smith, and, I wish Alex Smith was still playing, but unfortunately he's not. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick is the guy that's probably the most explosive out of those quarterbacks that I just named. Taylor Heineke is still on the roster, and I think Kyle Allen is still on the roster as well, but they're going to be the backups. Ryan Fitzpatrick's going to be the starter, most likely. And like I said, I think he's probably going to be, he's going to be very explosive. You got to worry about the turnovers, of course. But I think overall, with Logan Thomas, I think that's going to be a underrated connection in fantasy this season. And I think Logan Thomas could possibly have, in like his highest fantasy season yet, I think he can eclipse that 104.62 from last year, with Ryan Fitzpatrick as his quarterback. So Logan Thomas at number 6. Now, moving on to number 5 on this list, I have Mark Andrews, the tight end for the Baltimore Ravens. He will be entering his 4th season in the NFL, was a 3rd-round pick back in the 2018 NFL Draft. In 14 games last year, had 701 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, had 112 fantasy points, averaged 8 fantasy points per game. And that was a little bit lower than what he did back in 2019, averaged 9.5 points per game, 143.2 fantasy points, and he had 10 touchdowns in 2019. So looking through some of his best games from 2020, you got Week 1 against the Browns. He had 5 receptions for 58 yards and 2 touchdowns, had 17.8 fantasy points in that contest. In Week 4 against Washington, had 3 receptions for 57 yards and 2 touchdowns, 17.7 points in that contest. In Week 5 against the Bengals, he had 6 receptions for 56 yards and a touchdown, and he had 11.6 points in that game. In Week 11 against Tennessee, he had 5 receptions for 96 yards and a touchdown, 15.6 fantasy points in that contest. In Week 15 against Jacksonville, he had 5 receptions for 66 yards and a touchdown. He had 12.6. And overall, a couple of down games where, he had between, 2 and 4 points. But I think, again, he's another guy, if he's available to you, I think you should get. I think he is a top 5 tight end. I think he's proved that, And listen, with Lamar Jackson, obviously he can have a better quarterback. Lamar Jackson is a great playmaker, and I think they do have a nice connection. But let's see how, Lamar does, in year 3 as the starter. Well, at least as a full-time starter. Obviously he came into the league in 2018. Time is going by really fast. Now Lamar is going to be entering his 4th season in the NFL. Well, yeah, his 4th season in the NFL. But it'll be his 3rd full season as the starter. I think they do have a nice connection there. Let's see what the wide receivers do. I think it all depends on how the wide receivers do. If Rashad Bateman and Sammy Watkins come in and Marquise Brown ends up doing well, maybe his numbers maybe dip a little bit, but I think he's still one of the top weapons in Baltimore. And Baltimore's a run-first team. They're really not a team that's built to throw the football, 40, 50 times a game. But needless to say, I still think, Mark Andrews is one of the top tight ends. Like I keep saying, tight end position is very thin. So, you got to really, start these guys at the right time and, got to hope for the best for the most part with the tight end spot. It's really the worst position when it comes to fantasy. It's really the most frustrating position when it comes to fantasy, because a lot of these guys are very inconsistent and don't perform the way you want them to, unless, you're some of the guys that are higher up on this list as we move forward. But, again, Mark Andrews, I think, will be a top 10 tight end once again in fantasy, so he is at number 5. All right, so at number 4 on this list is Robert Tonyan, the tight end for the Green Bay Packers. Really had a breakout season for the Packers. He'll be entering his 4th season in the NFL, was a draft pick back in the 2017 NFL Draft, is 27 years old, was tight end 4 last year. In 16 games with the Packers, 586 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns, averaged 7.8 fantasy points per game, and had 124.6 fantasy points. Obviously his best season, and you look at some of his best games against the Saints in Week 3, 5 receptions for 50 yards and a touchdown, 11 points in that contest. By far his best game came against Atlanta in Week 4, had 6 receptions for 98 yards, 3 touchdowns, had 27.8 fantasy points in that contest. Then in the Colts game in Week 11, 5 receptions for 44 yards and a touchdown. He had 10.4 points in that contest. In Week 12, 5 receptions for 67 yards and a touchdown, 12.7 fantasy points. And was really, really consistent. I think a lot of it, some of his games it was kind of touchdown dependent, like his points in certain weeks really came off of the touchdowns that he got, but he was a very reliable tight end last year. I was fortunate enough that, someone dropped him and I picked him up, I took a chance on him, and, he did well. He did well down the stretch, and, obviously didn't propel me to a championship, but he was productive, and I think that as long as Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, once we get to, the regular season, I think Tonyan is going to have a great season once again. I think Rodgers loves to have, really good tight ends. I mean, obviously, going back to the days with Jermichael Finley and you had Jared Cook. Obviously, the Martellus Bennett experiment didn't really work out, but Rodgers loves to use his tight ends. And, I think that if he stays with Green Bay, I think Tonyan is going to have another good, solid season. So Robert Tonyan at number 4. And also, quick before I, get into number 3, this is on the assumption that Aaron Rodgers will be the quarterback. Now, if Aaron Rodgers is not the quarterback, then, this list is definitely going to change and Tonyan might dip a little bit. But as of right now, Aaron Rodgers is still the quarterback for Green Bay. So because of that, Robert Tonyan is still going to be at number 4. So moving on to number 3 on this list, we're down to the final 3. And I think it's pretty obvious what the final 3 are going to be, but I'm going to say them anyways. So at number 3 is Darren Waller. He was taken in the 6th round of the 2015 NFL Draft by the Baltimore Ravens. He'll be entering his 5th season in the NFL, and obviously is the tight end for the Las Vegas Raiders. And he was tight end 2 last year, and in 16 games last year, had 1,196 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns, averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game, and he had 171.6 fantasy points, and of course, that goes off of standard leagues. So, looking at some of his best games against the Saints in Week 2, 12 receptions for 105 yards and a touchdown, had 16.5 fantasy points in that contest. In Week 7 against Tampa Bay, 6 receptions for 50 yards and a touchdown, had 11 points in that contest. Then against the Chiefs in Week 11, 7 receptions for 88 yards and a touchdown, 14.8 fantasy points he got in that game. And then his best game was against the Jets, where he had 13 receptions for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns in Week 13. And yeah, he had 32 points there. And then in Week 15 against the Chargers, he had 9 receptions for 150 yards and a touchdown, 21 points in that contest. And Derek Carr actually left the game early, and Marcus Mariota, took over that game, so he was able to still produce there. Then against Miami in Week 16, 5 receptions for 112 yards, 11.2 fantasy points. And then finally, Week 17 against Denver, 9 receptions for 117 yards and a touchdown, had 17.7 fantasy points in that contest. The guy's a monster, and when you look at the Raiders, they don't really have a lot of weapons at wide receiver outside of Henry Ruggs and I guess Hunter Renfrow. So I think Darren Waller is going to continue to produce, and I think he's a guy that you must have as a tight end on your fantasy team if you're able to get him. He's a high-volume guy. He's been amazing, and I think he's going to continue to be productive as long as he doesn't get hurt and things like that. So I have him at number 3. And then moving on to number 2 is George Kittle, the tight end for the 49ers. He was taken in the 2017 NFL draft. He was a 5th-round pick. He'll be entering his 5th season in the NFL. He's 27 years old. He was tight end 19 last year, and that's because he only played in 8 games. 634 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 77.1 fantasy points. Averaged 9.6 fantasy points per game, though, in the few games that he did play in. And, huge drop-off from what he did back in 2018 and 2019. But I think he'll have a bounce-back season. I think he's going to be healthy. And, looking at some of his best games, the only 2 that were really, really good was Week 4 game against the Eagles. He had 15 receptions for 183 yards and a touchdown, 25.1 fantasy points there. And then in Week 6 against the Rams, 7 receptions for 109 yards and a touchdown, 16.9 fantasy points in that contest. What makes him really special is the fact that he's able to do this without, a star quarterback because, he didn't always have Jimmy Garoppolo. He had Nick Mullins and he had, C.J. Beathard throwing him the football. So the fact that he's able to do that, with quarterbacks like that is incredible. And, again, another guy that I think is going to have a bounce-back season after being riddled with injuries. So, yeah, George Kittle at number 2, and then obviously at number 1 is Travis Kelce. Had an amazing year in 2020. Looking at his statistics in 15 games, he had 1,416 yards, 11 touchdowns, averaged 13.9 fantasy points per game, which was ridiculous, and he had 207.76 fantasy points in 2020, and of course going off of standard leagues, and again, was super consistent. I think he's going to be great once again. He might even go in the first round, so, what else can you say? I talk about him a lot on the show. I think he's, again, possibly going to be a first-round pick. So, yeah, Travis Kelce's probably going to be the number 1 tight end once again in fantasy. So, those are the top 10 tight ends that I think will be the top 10 tight ends in 2021. So, with that, that is all the time that we have for today. I thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe to our social media platforms and write a nice review on our website. We greatly appreciate it. And that's all the time we got. So I'm Kenneth Grunfelder signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, saying have a good day, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.